Relations Council Committee. And before we start, can we have everyone to introduce themselves, starting with our council members who are virtual. Ms. Johnson?
Renee Johnson, District 4. I'm not a committee member. I'm just observing today. Thank you.
You're welcome. We have another committee member who's virtual. You like it?
Kari, committee member.
Okay.
Dante Anderson, District 1 committee member.
Okay. And our chair just arrived, so we will just do introduction.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hope you all had a safe, relaxing weekend. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, for doing the intro. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's see. I'm sorry. Oh, we didn't do an intro in the room. Okay, thank you, Mr. Winston. So why don't we go ahead with Mr. Fenton?
Yes, good afternoon, Dana. Thank you for speaking. Good afternoon. This is Dana Fenton with the City Manager's Office.
Lena James, Deputy City Attorney.
Brent Cagle, Assistant City Manager.
Patrick Baker, City Attorney.
James Mitchell, Vice Chair.
Lawana Mayfield, Committee Member.
Dimple Ajmera, Committee Chair.
Braxton Winston, Mayor Pro Tem.
Kay Cunningham, Mayor's Office. Marie Harris, Strategy and Budget.
Elizabeth Liu, Strategy and Budget.
Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, Catherine Creamer, Sustainability and Resilience, Mayor's Officer, Charlotte Perry, Financial System. Amanda Honaker with KTS Strategies.
Nelson Freeman with KTS Strategies.
Ryan Bergen, Budget Director.
Teresa Smith, CFO.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So Mr. Mitchell and I are pleased to lead this effort of this important newly created committee, thanks to Mayor Lyles. So today the committee will hear 3 presentations. So we have a packed agenda. First, Mr. Cagle will provide us an introduction to the committee and briefly discuss the committee's charge and the next steps. And then Ms. Lena James from the City Attorney's Office will lead the discussion around the Council's rule of procedure, specifically around virtual meetings. And last, Mr. Fenton will provide an overview of our city's federal and state legislative agenda. So we have a packed agenda today. I believe that you'll hear several themes throughout this meeting, especially the combination of budget, governance, and intergovernmental committee. And it's truly a merger of equals, which makes sense because of the interconnected nature of the work that we are doing. And there will be a committee report out at the end of today's meeting. So I hope that today's work is effective and efficient and allows the council to be more horizontally integrated. So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Cagle, who will be our point of contact for this committee. So why don't you walk us through our first presentation, Mr. Cagle?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you to the committee for having me here today. Okay, so first of all, just a quick overview on this presentation. First will be the new committee's charge. Second, new structure. You've already heard a merger of equals, if you will. The committee process, the referrals that we have, and this committee also has some standing work items, so we'll go through those standing items as well.
I see Ms. Anderson has, oh, sorry. I see that Ms. Anderson has joined. Did she introduce herself? She did. Okay, sir.
So starting off with the charge, the Budget Governance and Intergovernmental Relations Committee is, its purpose is reviews and recommends policies to fund community priorities, optimize use of public resources, and collaborate with other government partners. It's also important to note that when the mayor created the committees, she also assigned each committee responsibility over boards and commissions. So BGIR, or Budget Governance and Intergovernmental Relations, is responsible for oversight of Beckler Arts Foundation Board, Charlotte Equitable Development Commission, the Firemen's Relief Board of Trustees, Charlotte Mecklenburg Public Access Corporation, Mint Museum Board of Trustees, and last but not least, Privatization Competition Advisory Committee. And you will note in a couple slides, we'll talk more about the PCAC as it relates to referrals. So again, just a visual, as I said, the new structure is a merger of equals. It is resulting from the combination of intergovernmental relations and the Budget and Governance Committee. So the process. And again, this material is not new. It was also provided in the City Council's orientation notebook. So it has been out before. So first off, policy items are referred to the committee by the mayor, city manager, or a majority vote of full council. Referrals allow for in-depth consideration and review of an issue before being presented to full council for action. And referred items are taken up in committee based on priority. The next step, referral items are worked through in committee to develop a recommendation from the committee to full council. Referred items should be moved out of committee within 3 meetings. Some items that are reoccurring, so standing items, will not require action of full council, but will come in front of the committee. Then moving through the process, it's not moving. There we go. Moving through the process. When a policy item is ready for action and overview, and an overview is provided during the action review, there we go. Now I think we're back on track. I'm going to cross my fingers.
I think you want to go back.
Okay. All right. When a policy item is ready for action and an overview is provided during the action review to the full council, the council votes on the item shared during the action review and will occur at a future council meeting. I'm sorry, I misstated that. So first there's an action review, then at a future meeting, council would be asked to vote. Standard operating procedure that we've currently used. The request for council action for full council to vote on a recommendation coming out of a council committee will be included in the policy section of the meeting agenda and voted on during the business meeting. Committee referrals. So right now, well, as of the printing of this slide, there were 4 standing referrals. There is a new one yes, so each member should have received a hard copy, and I'll talk to it, and Mr. Finnan will discuss it more. So the first is virtual meetings. The last discussion came on May 12th, 2022, and that is the next item on your agenda for today. The second is financial stewardship. It was referred on June 6th, 2022, and we anticipate this item to come before the committee at its November meeting. It's a review of the current means by which organizations receive funding from the city. For each means of city funding, review the current reporting requirements and applicable state nonprofit regulatory requirements, and assess the adequacy of current reporting and whether or not additional measures are needed. The next is a boards and commissions review. It was referred September 12th, 2022. I will say that this item specifically came forward due to a request from the PCAC to council and the mayor to consider revisions to their citizens board charge. Strategy for mayor and city council to utilize while building relationships with state legislators. This was referred today, September 29th, by the mayor, and Mr. Fenton will discuss this more in his presentation. There is one more slide, and it is your standing items. So these come up every year as part of this committee. The annual comprehensive financial report, or the ACFR, will come before this committee. Audit reports and updates, including the annual audit plan. I believe next month the city auditor, Ms. Adams, would like to present this committee with her audit plan for the year. City Council annual strategy session agenda planning comes before this committee. Hospitality fund review comes before this committee. And then the federal and state legislative agenda. Okay. Now I've made it through.
Any questions, concerns? Ms. Meeker?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Cagle, we have a new item. The new item speaks to building relationships with state legislatures. When did that stop? Because previously we had a committee that, we had 2 to 3 members of council that attended the visits in Raleigh, met with our state reps. So when did this stop for this to now be a part of the agenda?
Yeah, Ms. Mayfield, I think that you are correct. This has been a normal part of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. I think Mr. Finnan could probably expand on this answer, but during COVID and over the last few years, while I don't believe that council stopped building relationships, I think that the how has changed, and now I believe what the mayor is saying is she would like to get back to a sort of standard routine where this committee or its members or other members of council start to build those relationships one-on-one or in person again.
So are we looking at the model that we previously had, or is this trying to create something new since we had a long-standing relationship with a number of our reps?
I'll defer to Mr. Fenton.
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Mayfield. In terms of developing strategy, I do recall very clearly before the pandemic, especially, we had several trips during the session up to the General Assembly to visit. And of course, the last 2 years of the pandemic, that hasn't been done for obvious reasons. But I do know that there are council members like Mayor Pro Tem Winston and Councilmember Bakari who have been up there quite a bit. And in terms of what a new process would look like, it's a blank piece of paper at this point. Certainly, maybe trips up to Raleigh would be helpful. But at the same time, we don't have a process or what would occur in mind right now. And that's something that we wanted to start with the committee today and take a few months to, next couple of meetings to talk about this further, try to get ideas out on the table.
So in the spirit of not reinventing the wheel, it may be helpful, especially since we have new members on council, to give an update or give a one-pager showing what previously was done, how many meetings were attended, since that was tracked through city liaisons, who was, whether 1 to 3 council members were attending those meetings and what that looked like, opposed to trying to create something that we already have a blueprint. Thank you.
Yeah, and to Ms. Mayfield's point, I had a conversation with Mayor about the strategy. So even cities like Durham and other cities across the state have significant physical presence in Raleigh, and I think that's what it's missing. So she had suggested doing occasional visits and creating a schedule of visits where all the committee members, including full council, will attend. And this is very critical as we continue to work on our infrastructure funding. But we can certainly dive into that as we actually learn more from the committee's work in the past. So do we want to dive into the second item now? Second item, I think it's going to take up most of our time, especially when it comes to virtual meeting discussion. So for those of you who are new to the council, I just want to give a brief background on how this came about. So during the pandemic, Governor had issued an emergency order, and that allowed municipalities across the state to meet virtually. So we have had virtual options, but then Governor's emergency order expired on August 15th. So since then, City Council has returned to meeting in person. And City Attorney had... Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Do I start from the beginning? Okay. So here we are on the second agenda item, and I just want to make sure that for those of you who are new to the council have a background on this topic. So first, during the pandemic, Governor had issued an emergency order which allowed municipalities across the state to meet virtually. And that emergency order expired earlier this year on August the 15th. And since then, council has started meeting in person. City Attorney did provide council with an update on this item on August 22nd. So this was before the new council was sworn in. So at the September 26th, a city council, full council decided to allow a virtual option for committee meetings. So this item, virtual option for committee meeting, has already been decided on. However, this item was referred back to this committee. So Ms. James, correct me if I missed anything, but if you can just go ahead and walk us through the second presentation, and feel free to add to anything that I missed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, council members. It's a privilege to be here. I have backup. I have Mr. Baker here as well, who can speak specifically to some of the items, particularly that were discussed at the August 22nd meeting. I was going to try to hone in on the item that came out of the council meeting on September the 26th and the action that was taken with referral, with reference to the city council committee meetings. So just as an overview, because this topic has been discussed for some time at the previous iteration of this particular committee, and because a couple of times over the last 2 years it was also discussed in front of council, and for the benefit of our new council members, wanted to kind of give you an overview on the current law as it stands, kind of the current status with respect to what council has been doing, and finally a slide with a proposal of a revision that can be made to the rule based on council's action on September 26th. So 3 slides, bear with me. And I will just note at the front that we tend to use the term electronic, virtual, and remote meetings a little bit interchangeably. They are not, under the law, remote meetings is a very defined term. I just want council to be aware of that. It does have a specific definition, and that definition is in the Emergency Management Act chapter of the state statutes. So you have open meetings, which is some set of statutes and laws, and then a separate area of the law is the Emergency Management Act, and actually remote meetings and pieces of that are actually defined and cross-referenced in other laws from that section. So, and then separate from that, and in a completely different chapter and section of the law is where electronic meetings is authorized. So just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of that overview. So electronic meetings, as you'll see at the top of that slide, we've had the authorization for that.
Her hand is raised? No. No.
Has,
Oh, okay.
No, it's not raised.
Okay, it's not raised, okay. So do you want her to remove that screen? Minimize that? Is it getting in the way?
No, I thought she was, Councilman Anderson was trying to speak, that's all.
Oh, okay.
no hands raised, so I'll proceed. Yeah, I'm still on the first slide, luckily, so not yet ready to click. On the first topic of the first slide. So electronic meetings, as I noted, has been in place for several years now, and Council's Rule 28 is essentially our rules of procedure, which are an attempt to codify that electronic meetings law, which essentially says under certain circumstances, council members may participate electronically. When the pandemic hit in 2020, one of the changes, so the governor issued the state of emergency, the statewide declaration of the state of emergency. I'm sorry, can we go back? So when the statewide state of emergency was declared, shortly after that, as municipalities started to meet electronically, the General Assembly passed a law that specifically defined remote meetings. And so that's the statutory reference that you see there in the second bullet, the 166A 1924. That's the remote meetings law. So what it did there, in a nutshell, it is only applicable to instances that are statewide states of emergency, unlike authorization that we do have to declare local states of emergency. But the remote meetings law is only triggered when there is a statewide state of emergency. Secondly, as I was referencing the open meetings law, the remote meetings law made very few changes to the open meetings law. The only areas that it did, in fact, change was adding some language in the voting statute, adding some language in the quorum, in closed session, and I will note in actually the electronic meetings law before that, that's right above there. Those 4 laws, that's not referenced in my bullet there, but there was a change there. And the bottom line is the change that the General Assembly made to voting, to quorum, to closed session, and to electronic meetings is it cross-referenced it to the emergency law and said remote meetings, if we're in a statewide state of emergency, you may trigger and meet as a public body under the remote meetings law. But if you're not, essentially, what that implies is that the authorization is not there. Mm-hmm. So Council's rules of procedure, Rule 28, references the legal basis for Rule 28. And then in a nutshell, Rule 28 has 2 parts. There's a section 28A that refers to committee meetings. And essentially what that allows is committee members to participate in council committee meetings if they are absent and need to, due to illness or injury, may participate by electronic or telephonic attendance. And secondly, that law allows committee members to vote. Rule 28B, Council's Rules of Procedures, has very specific conditions under which council members may meet. And I've listed those. Certainly if there is an emergency meeting, and again, there are state statutes that then underlie this authorization and emergency meetings and how they're defined. And council members may meet if there are regular or special meetings. And in those instances, a quorum is necessary. The conditions for either that regular or special meeting have to be because council cannot meet in person due to weather, civil unrest, or emergency, and, keyword is missing there at the end, and the meeting needs to continue in order to avoid having to renotice it, which is one of the legal meetings, and the meeting cannot be delayed. So in a nutshell, that is the current status of the law. I want to move to the next slide, which is, again, just recapping sort of where, as a council and as a committee, we landed. I think, as I said it, I think Chair Ajmira summarized some of this already. Again, the state of emergency gets triggered when there is a statewide declaration, either by the governor or the General Assembly. What we had been operating under was the governor's EO executive order, and so that allowed for the remote meetings for participation in all those instances. On August 15th, as you said, that ended. On August 22nd, council had some discussions on that. I'll defer to Mr. Baker if he wants to add to that. But I believe, I was not present at that meeting, so I know there were some discussions with respect to the areas that we would face legal issues and potential challenges to if council decided to continue to meet remotely for all their meetings with the full body. And I will just say in a nutshell, I think the advice that we have given to the council committee and to the council is consistent with what a number of other municipalities are doing, and is consistent for those who turn to the School of Government, is generally consistent with what the School of Government has advised, and is consistent with the laws that really govern how the public bodies can meet, open meetings, emergency management laws. And that brings us to, so that was the discussion in August 22nd. At the September 26th meeting, last Monday, is when council took the action that it did with respect to Rule 28A for only council meetings to allow committee members to be able to meet virtually for any reason, to put it frankly. I've put a couple of footnotes there that are specific to the law and to the legal areas. Let you look at that, but that brings us to the all right, there we go. Good thing, last slide. So this is Rule 28A. This is your rules of procedure, telephonic and electronic attendance at meetings. And what you see there for Rule 28A for committee meetings is a strikeout, which from the Attorney's Office we understood to be council's action last week, to take out the circumstances of reason for illness or injury, and obviously the notice piece of it. Now that we have been through 2.5 years of remote meetings, 48 hours does look very archaic. You will note that at the end of Rule 28A, there was, even before this, some language that allowed members to participate electronically, being permitted to vote. There have been no revisions to Rule 28B, which is with respect to council meetings. So I'll stop there and try to answer any questions if you have. Thank you.
So any questions on 28A? Looks like, because we just discussed this last Monday and council took an action on, so I don't know if there is any discussion that is needed here. Yeah. Ms. Johnson? You're recognized.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to know the statute that allows council members to meet in a committee meeting and to vote.
Ms. Johnson, there's not a specific statute, and hopefully you got my responses to your questions, and I'm happy to have this discussion publicly as well. There's not a specific statute that addresses committee meetings of council. Basically, these committee meetings come out in the general authority that you have in 160A 71C, which is that provides local governments with the ability to develop their own rules of procedure of how they're going to do their business.
Oh, okay. So 16071C allows us to create a policy to have virtual meetings.
No, what C says, and I'll read it specifically, the council may adopt its own rules of procedure not inconsistent with the city charter, general law, or generally accepted principles of parliamentary procedure. There's no reference to virtual meetings in 160A71C.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anything else, Ms. Johnson? Ms. Mayfield?
So, just for clarification, what we are discussing right now is a change. And the change is to revise Section A, Rule 28, to state committee meetings, council members may attend committee meetings by telephone or other electronic means. Members attending electronically are entitled to vote and fully participate in the business of the committee meeting.
That's correct, Ms. Mayfield.
I just wanted to make sure I had clarification. Thank you.
And that's essentially what the council
That's
did.
the council took an action on last Monday. So committee doesn't need to take an action on this item, right, Mr. Baker?
We just wanted you to see
Yeah, I wanted
what it
to
looks
see
like.
what, okay,
Yes.
got it. So really the focus is on 28B right now. So, Ms. James, you want to proceed with 28B?
You know, what the council action was last week was to vote specifically with respect to council committee attendance. So we limited our review and what we wanted to present and speak to this committee to 28A.
Okay.
There's an expectation that B, and this is really to simply reiterate that it is not the city attorney's recommendation that we provide for virtual meetings, virtual council meetings where council members can participate and vote in a situation where there's not a statewide emergency. Given the amount of statutory changes, including the creation of a whole new statutory framework and then changes to existing statutes such as quorum, voting, and what an actual official meeting means, and the inclusion of virtual ability to meet, and that virtual ability being tied to a state of emergency, we can't recommend that you proceed with council meetings without that state of emergency. So we are at a minimum, I would say we're not recommending changes to B, given the amount of changes that are out there. I would actually be going in the opposite direction, which is to clarify that Section B would come into play during a statewide emergency, because this was created back in, Section B, I think, came about in 2014, 2015, well before the new statutes and the new statutory framework. So I'm not sure whether or not even Section B, and I've not discussed this with the group, but I would either leave B the way that it is. We haven't used it, and it would come in such rare situations, and it's interesting when you see the last section of Section A where it clearly states that members attending electronically are entitled to vote and fully participate. You don't see that in B in terms of voting and participating as well. So it might be just to be there for an emergency meeting where you need to delay something, or as you see there, that emergency meeting piece as well. So at a minimum, leave it as it is, because I just don't think there's a legal authority to have virtual meetings outside of the state of emergency. There has been some question, if I'm saying that you don't have the legal authority to do it in a council meeting, but you do have the legal authority to do it in the committee meeting, what's the difference? The difference is that the committee meetings, you're not actually binding the city to anything. This is about how you do your work and sort of processing the work, but it's at the council meeting that you're actually setting binding policy, changing land use, and entering into millions of dollars of contracts, and that doesn't occur in this meeting. So that's the basis for doing that. Do I have a statute that says that? No. But that's my belief, is that it's hard to imagine being challenged for a committee recommendation that was prepared electronically, since it's not binding on the city or the city council.
Fair enough. And I know we had this discussion over the weekend about the difference. So the recommendation is to not proceed with a virtual option when it comes to council meetings. Any questions? Mr. Winston, do you want to chime in?
I just have a question about 28B1. If I'm reading it correctly, it does read that council members may attend regular meetings virtually if it's necessary to achieve a quorum. So I feel like the legal explanation you gave us, that rule would run amok of what is legally defensible and probably should be changed to reflect, if that's the stance we're taking.
Yeah, if we're going to make any changes, I would actually peel it back as
right.
opposed to moving it forward. And of course, that was put into place well before the statutory changes, yes.
I would think that might come in play if there is a civil unrest where you need a quorum.
But that's what I was, if we're saying that it should
all
only
three
be for
conditions.
certain
Right.
conditions to be met, but it reads right now that
And
as being able to achieve quorum for a regular meeting, and I think that's.
maybe, and second, it has to meet the and second. Is that the intent?
The intent is all three conditions have to be
Okay.
met, that it's a special or regular
Got it.
meeting, it's necessary to achieve a quorum, one of those emergency conditions is happening, and that the meeting cannot be delayed or renoticed and action is necessary.
And if you see the difference in the first paragraph of B, there is council members may attend for emergency meetings, period. And then the second sentence is a different line, which is attending regular and special meetings. So those are non-emergency meetings, and then you have to meet all three. I will say this, and I've spoken with Mr. Fenton about this and the manager. There is some discussion among cities about seeking some additional legislation to clarify, for instance, if there is a localized emergency that's not a statewide emergency, has what the General Assembly done created a situation where we can't have a virtual meeting at all because it's not a statewide emergency. And we are having some of those discussions. I would love to have, as a lawyer, I always like to have clarity. It's one thing to say, yeah, I'm not sure, maybe not, but I would prefer to have some clarity. And I think it would be great if for localized emergencies that local governments have some fairly limited authority to address a localized emergency that doesn't tip the statewide emergency piece. And that's something that if the group, it's not so much tied to this item, but it may be something that we want to think about. And I will tell you that we are having some discussions among city attorneys about potentially working with the league to move. And I would never obviously do that without the committee, but we're just having some general conversations to hopefully bring back to this committee and the council.
All right. Yes, Mr. Mitchell.
So I'm kind of perplexed about this item seems to keep getting kicked down the road, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to understand where is the angst among staff and council members? Because I can only remember, I'm dating myself, Nancy Carter's here, my former colleague, so she can attest to it. The only time we made exceptions, and this was way back, is when the late Mayor Pro Tem Susan Burgess was sick and had cancer. And thank you, Councilman Mayfield. And we allowed her to join via telephone. So I do think there are certain illness that we ought to be very sensitive to. I don't think this council or the previous council is trying to quiet voices or leave people out of the room. But I do think when I look at number 2, attendance preclude to civil unrest. I do remember we had the unreadiness here that there was a lot of us talking about, do we engage and do we continue on with business? It came out of this committee last year with 3-2.
Yes, it was for both committee and council meetings. So this committee has reviewed this topic for twice. No, this is third time. So hopefully we provide clarity to the full council so it doesn't get kicked over again.
Yeah. So Madam Chair, do we need to add then, and I'm just throwing this out, because we are in this COVID kind of environment, do you add then attendance preclude the weather, civil arrest, emergency, Or do we make an exception for some of us? I've had COVID before, and thank God I got over it. Do we need to make an exception for COVID?
Or like any medical, anything. So to Mr. Mitchell's point, Mayor Pro Tem Susan Burgess had
That's right.
a very unique situation there, right, with medical. So I don't know if that's something, Mr. Baker, you want to respond to.
So that's something that we could look at. It gets back to the issue that I have now that the General Assembly has come in to talk about state of emergencies and tied everything to the state of emergency.
Right.
Prior to 2020, I think among lawyers, the issue was whether or not there was some flexibility because it wasn't clear.
Right.
And I think that there were some small communities that actually went forward under the idea that it's not clear.
Right.
So we don't know. And that was the advice that we were getting from the School of Government. I think given what the General Assembly has done here, there's more clarity because they've made it very clear that you can do virtual participation tied to the state of emergency, which I think deprives us of that ability to talk about the lack of clarity.
Yeah.
And that's where I'd like to get to that point where we've got some flexibility to do something like what you're saying. Or a situation where it's a localized emergency, it's not a statewide emergency. But I'm not sure that we've got that authority, even as practical as it sounds. I don't know that we have the authority to do that. And then you get to the issue of, as I said, that noticing, what's in A, members are entitled to fully vote and participate, and in B, that doesn't exist. So are we talking about participate as in watch the, and contribute but not vote? Are we considering it for purposes of a quorum as well? If you're talking about a situation, and again, I'm making this up as I'm thinking it, which is a terrible position for me to be in. But I think if to extend a courtesy to a council member of, we want to hear from you during this process, but we're not considering you for purposes of quorum and voting because of this, new structure that we have. That's a lot easier because we're not tying this to quorum, we're not tying this to voting until that there's some clarity in the legislation.
Yes, Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a follow-up. And so, Pat, I don't mean to put you and Date on the spot, but you're right, and I know how things move slow. So do you think this is a 90-day and we might have the authority to do some local, or you said we have no idea, this is going for another 6 months? I'm of the opinion we need to get this behind us. There's other pressing stuff before this council, but just like to get you all take from a time frame perspective.
Your thoughts about time? I mean, if we agree to some language that we would like for our legislators to consider, I don't know when they make those decisions during the process. I don't think the session opens until January.
That is correct. The 2023 long session of the General Assembly will open in mid-January. They'll get going for good towards the end of the month. And typically, you can plan on them being in session through the end of June, and sometimes even later, as you might have seen quite a bit in the last couple of years.
And see, may I do a follow-up, Madam Chair? And as a priority, I cannot see this getting in front of transit tax and other things that we'll need from a priority standpoint. I just hope we can come to a conclusion today, and so we can move this back to council and get this behind us.
Right. Well, the recommendations, Mr. Baker, is that because of the potential legal challenges that you don't recommend, but I know you added something where potentially if we were to provide an option just to participate, not vote, what would that look like, and would that require state legislators' approval? Because I think to Mr. Mitchell's point, where if there is a medical emergency or for an example, COVID situation that Ms. Johnson had earlier this year, could she have just participated virtually versus just actually vote?
So I want to put a big asterisk beside everything that I'm about to say because I'm thinking it as I go. But I can't come up with a legal reason if I'm challenging a decision of council where 10 of you were in the room, the 11th is commenting virtually, but not counted for purposes of quorum or voting, and that the vote is whatever, 10-0 or whatever. I can't see the legal basis for saying that that vote was illegal, because they weren't counted for quorum and their vote wasn't counted. They just participated like a citizen could participate. I'll think about it a little bit more, but I can't think of a reason. Lena, if you've got something, you haven't kicked me under the table yet.
But it's probably a good time to start.
Yeah.
I think our position is essentially, those are two big legal issues, and I think the more the law has changed and the more the legislature redefined it and made some changes even in 2021 to the remote meetings law, which again is in the Emergency Management Act, the more that has happened, I think that essentially suggests that had that authority existed in the open meetings law, they would not have had to put in the limitations and the guardrails that they did and
Right.
tie it to the emergency. So by virtue of the fact that they did that, I think that gives us an answer. May not be the answer you like, but it does.
Mr. Winston, did you have some?
No, I was just gonna, mention what the situation Mr. Mitchell brought up, and I wrote everybody just a note
Yeah.
on it. It doesn't seem wise to try to use
Right.
electronic means for, to reach quorum, or if we did attempt to try to provide a virtual option for people to speak to the public record, or council members, and staff, or the public alike. If the council members decided to tell what their intentions were, if it was counted as a 6th vote, it would seem like it would put that vote in danger of being nullified, and that wouldn't be smart. But I think, if it is council's desire to figure out how to increase, participation virtually, that might be a different conversation. But still something that could get tested in some way, shape, or form. It really is up to, our appetite for that kind of legal risk.
And I definitely don't need an asterisk to say I would prefer to have legislation that clarifies it.
Got it.
Yeah, or we could put it on our, decide to put it on our legislative agenda.
And just ask for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it. So it looks like so far from the committee, looks like everyone is on board with the attorney's recommendations. Any virtual?
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Bakari, and I don't know if Ms. Johnson still has her hand raised or she has a new question, but Mr. Bakari.
Yeah, I think I can help clarify some of this.
Okay.
The reason why we are in this position and having had the conversation multiple times is because there have been one or two people that have a position on this that have structured how we've had the conversation. And the conversation has been discussed in a way where it's been, what are the reasons why we shouldn't do it in the law today? And I would say that I agree with some of the points, I disagree with some of them. There are municipalities before the pandemic in North Carolina that have done this thing virtually successfully. So I think the problem is that we as a council have not sat down and had a vote on what our will is. And is our will completely virtual, hybrid, only in person? The problem has been we've been structured into these very specific agenda discussions where, just like now, well, here's why we can't recommend this or it's gray. I think the question that puts this to bed once and for all is the council saying, yes, we want to have a hybrid option, or we want to have it under these circumstances, or we don't want to have it all. Yeah. And at a committee level, I think it's a no-brainer because committees aren't real. We have conversations in committees. We do work in committees. No one takes any binding action, only recommendations at best. So you can put all that one side and we can make that decision as we need to. The question is when we make formal votes. And I think there have been one or two folks that have very much not wanted that to exist, that have shaped the conversation. There have been one or two folks that really want it to exist and have pushed back under the confines of this discussion. If we want to put it to bed once and for all, I think the very no-brainer, easy approach is what's the will of the council? And if the will of the council is a full hybrid option going forward, which I'm not sure I'm even in support of, not because it doesn't make sense for 2022, but because we're in a time period where we need to be working together in the same room to become more of a high-performing team. But that's fine. I think once we say that will, Then we send the attorneys off to say, make this happen and give us the options that make the most sense. And maybe that's legislative agenda, maybe it's something else. But as long as we keep having the debate on the terms that have been predefined for us, we will never come to a conclusion and we'll keep battling it out.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Anything else?
Ms. Johnson, did you still have a question?
I do, thank you. I think Councilmember Bakari put that excellently. Thank you. He's absolutely right. And maybe I'm looking at this black and white, but I hear that, you know, the same statute that allows for committee meetings, we could lean on for council meetings as well. I mean, the attorney quoted 160.71.c that allows us to develop our own policies. There is no language in the statute that prohibits it. We had remote meetings prior to COVID, and we, as the previous council, even had a motion to approve virtual meetings outside of the governor's order. And we, as a council, took the step to sunset that policy along with to mirror the governor's order. So are we saying what we did previously was not legal? We all know that any of our decisions are subject to challenge, to legal challenge. So I just don't understand the dissection that we can say, well, we have the ability to set our own policy. There's nothing in the law, and we will carve this out for committee meetings and not council meetings because, and we've heard this many times, because we need team building, because we want behind the scenes meetings, because there are individuals who wouldn't say in person what they would say on the computer. But it's not about the work, and it's not about accessibility. We passed a $3.2 billion budget virtually. We passed India, we passed the SOID, and it's proven in 2022 that we can get this work done virtually. So I know I'm not on the committee, but I think of accessibility. I was the member that was shut out of a very important decision because of COVID, and we're 29 months into COVID. It just seemed so ridiculous to me as the 14th largest city. So I think we need to think outside of the box and continue to get the work done regarding the COVID, maternity leaves, sickness. We need to be nimble and flexible. And that's just my opinion in all meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. So committee members, any motions on this, or do we move forward with the third item on our agenda? Okay, any hands raised virtually?
Oh, sorry. Ms. Anderson?
Ms. Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can we ask Mr. Baker to give a perspective of other metro cities in the state of North Carolina and whether any like cities like Charlotte have hybrid or remote options today for their council meetings?
I am not aware of any of the larger cities that are doing this. And by larger, I'm talking Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Durham, Raleigh. And I think I've talked with the city attorney in Asheville. They are discussing something, but I don't know if it is requesting specific legislation from the legislature or not. I'll double check. But we are having sort of an ongoing conversation. I'm not aware of a municipality of any significant size, and by that over 25,000 people, that are conducting hybrid meetings or virtual meetings of any kind outside of the state of emergency.
Thank you. I do agree with my colleague, Mr. Bakari, that effectively it sounds like this is going to come down to the will of the council. And as this is the third time that this topic has been in committee, instead of rotating back and forth, get an understanding of is this really and truly the will of the council to have this option? And if so, then we need to request staff to go and prepare a list of options and alternatives. So I think we do need to answer that question within council.
I agree, Ms. Anderson. So far, in absence of any motion, I'm assuming that the committee feels, committee is going with the recommendations of Mr. Attorney. Please correct.
I would make a motion.
Okay, Mr. Bukhari.
I'll just make a motion that until the full council votes their will in this matter, we no longer take up distracting sub-discussions on it in any committee meetings. That's it.
Ms. Mayfield, you want to say something? Ms. Mayfield?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So for clarification, Mr. Baker, what you need from this committee is a motion to either move forward, so approve or deny. To deny the recommendation or to approve the revision that's in front of us as stated with revision A and B that identifies for committee meetings, you will have the ability to attend in person through telephone or electronic, but for council meetings, it is only one of these three bullets necessary to achieve quorum. Attendance is precluded due to weather, civil unrest, emergency, or the meeting needs to be continued will be the only reasons that a council member will be able to participate via telephone or online. Other than that, then that council member should be in person if it is a council meeting and we have quorum.
That's correct. B is what you've had. A is our attempt to codify what you voted on last Monday. And if you could just acknowledge that that A is consistent with what you voted on, I think that's all right.
So the motion is to move approval of what is in front of us, the revision to A and accepting B, or to move to deny it.
Correct.
Move to approve.
Okay.
So it's either going to get a second or not, so that we can end this.
Okay,
So just from a procedural, Mr. Bakari put forth a motion that
but
I didn't hear.
do we have a second on Mr. Bukhari's motion? Okay, so that motion fails. Ms. Mayfield put her motion. Okay, do we have a second on that motion?
Second.
Okay, all in favor, say yes.
Aye.
Aye.
You gotta do a roll.
Aye, and, oh yeah, we have sorry. Ms. Anderson? Ms. Anderson?
Nay. No.
Mr. Bukhari? Mr. Bukhari?
No?
Okay. All right, I'll say yes. So we have 3 yes, 2 no, and this will be the recommendations of the committee. We'll give an update to the full council later today. Okay? All right, so we have the third item on our agenda today, which is intergovernmental relations. I remember in 2016, Ms. Mayfield and I were in the same room with Representative Bradford to rally, and we were lobbying for some of our infrastructure funding back then. So I'm looking forward to another visit. Mr. Fenton, if you can just walk us through the presentation for intergovernmental relations, and then we'll discuss the strategy in our next meeting.
Very good. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And by the way, I do remember that meeting very clearly from 2016. Let's go to the next slide, please. Overview. We'll be giving you a status update on the status of your 2022 federal and state legislative agendas. And then we'll talk about a process for adopting 2023 federal and state legislative agendas, which of course that's one of your standing items in front of this committee. And then we'll kick off the engagement discussion, and then we'll look at a calendar for the next steps. There we go. There we go. First of all, just want to bring to you what is a legislative agenda. It is a program of proposed legislative initiatives to support policies and programs of the city government. And annually, the City Council adopts these agendas to guide its advocacy in a given legislative sessions. And the agendas are intended to serve as a unifying voice for mayor and city council. And by that, I know it'll be surprised to some that it's not always that everybody agrees with everybody else. So it's good to have a document like this that speaks for the city. And the current legislative agendas were adopted by the City Council last November 22nd. Let's start with the U.S. Congress, your 2022 federal legislative agenda. Just want to note for the record that we do have federal contract lobbyists working for the city, Holland and Knight. They are what's considered to be a blue chip firm, and they have expertise in all the areas that are of importance to the city. And the person I work with on a weekly basis, Shauna Watley, is not able to make it today, but she will be attending the meeting starting next month. Talk a little bit about some of the notable accomplishments of the current U.S. Congress as they relate to your strategic priorities. You've had about 5 pieces of legislation we've seen go through the last 2 years. The American Rescue Plan last year provided a lot of funding for housing, aviation, transit, and for other city needs. The bipartisan infrastructure law, a big package, a once-in-a-generation package passed last year, provides federal funding for many different activities like transit, roads, Vision Zero, strategic energy action plan initiatives, digital inclusion, for example. Then there was, earlier this year, you had the Inflation Reduction Act, and it provided additional funding, especially for climate, and it really does support what you have in your strategic energy action plan that was adopted, I think, in 2019, if I remember correctly. The chips
18.
18, okay.
See ya.
Okay, you were very instrumental in that, yes. The Chips and Science Act, that was passed earlier this year. Probably heard a little bit about it. Probably what all the articles started off with is that it puts a lot more money into manufacturing computer chips here in this country, but it also does have a strong economic development, jobs and workforce development piece to it, in that it puts money into STEM education at colleges and universities, including a carve-out for minority serving institutions like Johnson C. Smith University and other HBCUs around the state and the country. And then we had the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that passed earlier this year. It put some additional protocols in place as a result of the tragic shooting that occurred down in Texas earlier this summer. Their 2-year session, they'll be finished this late December. They got exactly 3 months left to go. And of course, all the members of the House of Representatives are up for re-election, and a third of the U.S. Senate is up for re-election this year. And that means a new Congress will convene in early January, and we'll have some new players there. And at some point in the future, Madam Chair, I'd like to try to arrange some sort of a briefing for the committee and or the council on some of those major changes. Let's go to your legislative agenda. The first one addresses infrastructure and community needs. And this is sort of a catch-all for the different types of grant funding we would be trying to seek. It has a lot of different areas, everything from aviation to cybersecurity, digital inclusion, affordable housing, and all that. And this was intended as a one-year replacement for what we had previously. We were able to make a lot of progress last year because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. A couple of things we're working on right now: airfield improvement projects, the 4th parallel runway at the airport, working closely with aviation, who's working with the FAA. We're working through our federal lobbyist to our delegation. And that's probably going to be about a $1.5 to $1.6 billion project. And there would be quite a bit of funding we would be trying to seek from the federal government for that project. There's also an earmark pending in the U.S. Congress for an additional $1 million for your Alternative to Violence program. A few weeks ago, you did appropriate the funding, what was appropriated in the FY fiscal year 2022 federal budget, but we're trying to seek a second earmark for fiscal year 2023 of the same amount. And I'll just repeat what Mr. Rios said a couple of weeks ago, and that this is something that Congresswoman Alba Adams was very, very instrumental in getting. She was the sponsor of our request. And then, of course, right now, the Congress is wrestling with fiscal year 2023 appropriations, and there could be some more things in there that will help us in some of these areas that we've listed up above. And of course, you never know until the bill is signed into law what's going to be in there. So there's going to be a lot of negotiations this year. The Congress did extend the current fiscal year budget, or the fiscal year 2022 budget into part of fiscal year 2023. And we do expect that when they get back into town to, in fact, they are working right now on the budget for fiscal year 2023. Moving on to your other priority, comprehensive immigration reform. If I could get,
Next slide.
yeah. Yeah, yep, yes, please do that. You can see no work there for me. Okay. Oh, there it is. Yes, this is a position that was adopted first, I think, in year 2019, I believe, and I remember, Madam Chair, you served on an ad hoc committee, and I don't recall who else.
It was Mr. Winston and
was
I.
on there?
Oh, Smudge.
Oh,
Oh,
Mr.
yeah,
Mitchell?
Mr. Mitchell, too.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And so this is the position that has been used for the last couple of years, focusing on the H-1B visa program, the TPS, the DACA's program, and also for asylum seekers. There was some activity last year in the U.S. House of Representatives to try to get comprehensive reform going. But those bills that passed, they were not either not voted in by the Senate or did not meet the Senate procedural rules. And right now, we do know that Senator Tillis is part of a leader of a bipartisan group that's trying to find some common ground to get some legislation passed this year. He was at the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance meeting last week on Tuesday, and he made a strong mention that of all the bipartisan efforts he's working on, this is the only one he will be taking up for the remainder of the Congress. And he even said that some new text would be released later this month. And this is we had come to the conclusion that this effort would not be going forward this year because of time constraints, but it was good to hear, though, that he is still trying to work on it and that text would be issued. So let's now turn to the North Carolina General Assembly. And I think I need some more help, Marie, with going to the next one. I would just like the U.S. Congress, we have state contract lobbyists who work with us, and three members of the team are here today. And Nelson Freeman, if you would raise your hand. And Amanda Honecker, please raise your hand. And John Easterling, raise your hand. Thank you very much for being here today. And they're very, very helpful to us, and they can help us navigate the General Assembly much more effectively than we were doing in the past. There's some last 2 years, the General Assembly has done some things that support your strategic priorities. Last year, they enacted some police reform measures. And also, they had the energy plan, or the energy bill that passed, that basically calls for carbon neutrality and electric generation by the year 2050, which is pretty consistent with what you have here locally in your Strategic Energy Action Plan. This year, they did pay attention to NCDOT. They put some more money into DOT, both operations and maintenance, that could help some with the projects that have been delayed the last few years. And what they did was they took a portion of the state's general fund sales tax revenues and shifted that to transportation on a continuing recurring basis. And it could be up to $500 million per year by the time they're fully implemented. It's going to be a 3-year implementation.
Is that recurring or is just one time?
It's recurring.
Oh, it's recurring?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Great.
Also, the General Assembly increased capital funding, their capital funding program for commercial service airports like Charlotte Douglas. They increased the amount by 1/3, and Charlotte Douglas's share went up from about $27 million to $36 million per year. And that's, and I believe that we had gotten our first, in fiscal year 2019, we were able to get our first tranche of that funding. And so since 2018, we've been able to get $36 million more per year for Charlotte Douglas. And also, they have shown a strong support for economic development incentive programs. Right now, there's a lot of action in rural areas with manufacturing. I was on a call a few months ago where Chris Chung of the Economic Development Partnership presented, and he said that you're seeing right now more manufacturing-related type of projects rather than corporate relocations or corporate office projects. So and that's been over the years, rural areas have said, hey, most of the funding goes to the big urban areas like Charlotte, Raleigh, et cetera. But now you could say, hey, there's a lot more on the table right now for rural areas. And you've seen that in some of their announcements the last few years. You have the Toyota battery power plant, which is south of Greensboro. You've got the electric car manufacturer VinFast in, I think it's Chatham County. And then Wolfspeed is announcing a manufacturing plant, and I think that's in Chatham County too, right? That's correct. Yeah,
So has there been any discussion on modifying the program for corporate? Because with more virtual world that we live in today, I know there have been discussions about potentially changing some of these incentive programs to lure this corporate headquarters in. Has there been any discussions at the state level?
Well, I think they put a lot of funding into it. For example, the Honeywell.
Right, but like in the case of Centene, right, where their workforce is operating virtually, right, those incentives didn't necessarily result into the headcount here locally.
Right.
But has there been any discussion to obviously, it's great for manufacturing facilities, right? But I was wondering if there was any discussion about potentially modifying this program.
There has, it's only happened in the last few months since Centene made their announcement.
Right.
But also, again, with the jobs that are coming, what you have here is an impact on the state that is a positive impact in terms of additional tax revenue, things like that. So I think that's what they're looking at. I think that's probably the challenge they'd have to try to overcome if you were bringing in the headquarters for a virtual operation. I would think that again.
Is to how to account for that revenue, right? If it's not through property tax.
Right.
Or improvements, buildings.
Somebody could be remote in Hawaii.
Right.
And working here, so. But we'll keep an eye on that.
Okay.
The General Assembly, they finished the bulk of their work in June. They do have some monthly 2 to 3 day sessions scheduled to take up issues that need immediate attention. And of course, all the members of the North Carolina House and Senate are up for re-election in November. So it should be, I think by December, we'll get a pretty good feel for how things are going to look. And their long session next year starts on January 11th, and probably about 2 weeks after that, on the 25th, I believe, is when they come back to continue the long session. What they do on January 11th is basically an organizational meeting. They do the elections of the officers, the Speaker of the House, et cetera, things like that. Marie, I need your help again. Now let's go to your legislative agenda. The first one is mobility, and this was directed at largely the efforts we're trying to make here locally to get additional sources of revenue for transportation, whether public, roads, et cetera. But we also had in here the state, that we also recognized that the state needed more funding in its construction program. I remember a couple of years ago when the committee adopted this for the first time, we did hear from Councilmember Watlington about Steel Creek Road project being delayed. And I think Mr. Bakari brought up the US 74. So anyways, we did see some, again, the infusion of money this year into the state DOT. But also at the same time, we did try to get the Powell bill funding that was cut back a few years ago to the city of Charlotte and Raleigh, or the cities of Charlotte and Raleigh restored, but that was not done. Next slide. Let's go to the infrastructure and community needs slide. This is sort of like the state twin to the federal legislative position of the same name. A lot of the funding that is being provided through the bipartisan infrastructure law, for example, will be directed to states for further distribution. And that could involve some competitive grants. It could involve some formula funds that have to go down to local governments. It could involve loans. For example, water, sewer, and stormwater are always looking at some of the Clean Water Act loans that are made available each year. And additional funding for all that was provided in the bipartisan infrastructure law. But it turned into regular recurring money from the NCDOT budget. There was a $10 million earmark in there for the construction of the Carolina Aviations Museum, which will help with jobs and workforce development, hopefully grow the talent pool in this area of people who want to work in the aviation industry. And then, of course, last week, the governor did launch his, they call the Digital Equity Grant Program. This is using funds from the American Rescue Plan that are available. $24 million is being made available statewide. $10 million of that goes to state institutions to get these programs of digital inclusion going. But $14 million will be open to a list of groups that includes municipalities working with nonprofits, community-based organizations, and other stakeholder groups for local digital inclusion projects. And yes, thank you very much. That concludes the state 2022 legislative agenda. Let's turn now to the adoption for the 2023 federal state legislative agendas. With your new schedule, we are targeting Monday, January 23rd for a vote of the City Council for adoption of legislative agendas. And, we talked a little bit about the dates when the General Assembly begins. I do not see that date as detrimental to our efforts. In fact, because of the need for consideration by this committee and City Council, I believe it's a good date to go with. And it also provides time for this committee to develop an engagement strategy with the General Assembly. Anne Marie, can you go 2 more slides to the calendar, please? Thank you very much. What we are proposing at your next meeting on November 7th is a staff presentation on federal and state legislative issues that we see coming at us. We call it the legislative radar, I guess. Good way of putting it. And also continue the discussion on engagement with the General Assembly at that time. And then at some point after the election, hopefully before December 5th, there could be some post-election briefings set up. And then on December 5th, the first Monday in December, the committee would hear the legislative request and then also continue that discussion on engagement with the General Assembly. And then at the Tuesday, January 3rd meeting of committees, that the first Monday is the day after New Year's Day, that would be the time for the committee to propose federal and state legislative agendas. And then, of course, that evening you could have the City Council committee discussion, bring it up there. Following week, we would have an action review item to formally present the agendas, and then a vote on January 23rd. And then sometime after that, we'd have to get this scheduled with our state delegation is get a briefing scheduled. And last couple of years, we've been doing the virtual briefings, and certainly it would be nice to do those in person again.
Yeah.
I know that maybe not everybody would be able to make something like that, but I know that there's a lot of people in our delegation who would like to have a in-person briefing. And then at some point, and actually, we know definitely the National League of Cities has their annual legislative conference in D.C., March 26th through the 29th. And we traditionally have our visits to Capitol Hill during that event. So I put on there the 29th is a Wednesday. I think the conference actually ends on Tuesday, the 28th. But we would work with you all to schedule the briefings, find out who's going to be in D.C. at that time, and what else. We try to consider, too, what's going on with the National League of Cities Conference itself. I know for those of you who attend, you don't want to, there's a lot of important sessions that are being held that you really don't want to miss. So we try to work with you on that.
Mr. Mitchell has a lot of connections to the NLC. I'll be our cheerleader.
That's right. In fact, one good thing that the league has done, and I don't know this was in effect when, yeah, that's right, you left council early last year. One thing they used to have, they had everything in the conference going from like starting Monday morning through mid-afternoon on Wednesday, and that really made it difficult to schedule. Now they stopped basically, they did last year, they stopped the conference really at noon time on Tuesday. So it gives you more time to look at for going up to Capitol Hill. And Marie, if you could go back one more slide, or two slides to it says engagement with the General Assembly. And before I begin, let me just say, Councilmember Mayfield, I have your request noted on here. And yeah, you're right. We used to make the in-person trips up there, and I'll be glad to get more information about that to the committee. And I think you all know what good can come from building bridges with legislators. It gives us I guess really when you come down to it, I'd say the last sub-bullet, broader relationships for deeper discussions. So I've been in discussions where they can get deep, and I've been in discussions where they don't get deep. Mm-hmm. I know that you all would rather have deeper discussions with legislators. And at the same time, let me assure you all, state legislators want you to come up to Raleigh. They want to meet with you. They want you to see the committee process. They want you to see what it's like for the floor votes. They want you to get a taste of it, of the challenges that they face. And especially important in our delegation because 16 of our 17 members are Democrats, and they are the minority party right now. And I think I saw Mr. And again, we can continue this discussion in November as well. And Madam Chair, that's it. That's all I have for you today.
Okay. Any questions from the committee? Mr. Mitchell?
Mr. Fitton, great job as always. I'm going to take a page for Councilmember Mayfield when she says some of this we have had a model in the past. I thought it's been pretty successful. So let me just throw out a couple of ideas for us to consider. I totally agree. I think the in-person breakfast in the past have been very successful. I understand COVID, but you build better relationships, I think, when people can see you, touch you, and really.
About the touch part.
Yeah. But, see you and engage. Secondly, I think there's some low-hanging fruits we can do as well. When we have, economic development announcement or press conference, if we can invite our representatives to those press conferences as well. I mean, some of the big bills down the road, we're going to need to work as a team, and I think just extending them invitation to attend. I think we had an event at the airport, and I can't remember, that's in Becky's district or whoever, or Muhammad, but, just the invite, I think, goes a long way. I think thirdly, one thing that always has stretched for us is compare our delegates with the committees we serve on. And so once they get seated, I guess January 23rd, those delegations on the Transportation Committee, so we'll know who those are, those delegations, who's on the Budget Committee, then, Chair, Ms. Ashmere. I think, so going a step farther and making sure we spend time with those delegation members as well. I do think this is bipartisan, and so we got Councilmember Bakari and Councilmember Driggs who could do heavy lifting for us, because you're right, our delegation is 16, 17 Democrats, but actually in Raleigh, Republicans have key positions. So we need to make sure we leverage everybody's relationship as we go to Raleigh. So, thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, great insight. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Any other recommendations? I know Mr. Winston has done some of this past couple of years, so Mr. Winston, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking to Ms. Mayfield's comments at the beginning, maybe this is something we ask, Mayor Lyles to speak a little more to in terms of her approach. But, you're right that there are some things that we have done in the past, but it's usually around the legislative agenda, or it's usually around our own kind of individual relationships and our individual kind of works that we're doing with different leaders. I think the intent is what Mr. Fenton was talking about, is that kind of constant presence that is not specifically around the asks that we're making on our legislative agenda, but does have some of that kind of team coordination where we're also not freelancing by ourselves. As we're dealing with some of those, these bigger issues, as you were saying, Mr. Mitchell, like for instance, transportation. Transportation is a real regional real regional approaches that are having, and some real regional conversations that are occurring that we're not always represented at. That again might not fall specifically to our legislative agenda, but how do we get up there and build be in tune with those conversations that are happening in the region and around the state, so that we have a better kind of informed contextual conversation around policies and about asks that we are making. We really learned that last year or last term when we were dealing with this kind of regional transportation conversation. We missed out, I think, on some abilities for us to, maybe form some relationships that could help us. So again, maybe this is something we could speak at the end of the day. But it is a slightly different, nuanced approach to what we've been doing in the past.
Ms. Mayfield.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Along the lines of Councilmember Winston's comments, one of the things previously that I think helped us is also identifying some of those shared goals with our partner elected officials that are under the same umbrella of our state reps, so those in Mount Holly, Huntersville, Iredell, along that line, that are looking at some of the same transportation concerns or looking at funding in the same areas of housing. We might have an opportunity to build those relationships, and we actually create our lobby days to go up together. And we have for those who attend, they have their bullet points, and those bullet points are consistent, so that our representatives hear that no, it's not just Charlotte saying that this is an issue. You've heard this issue from the surrounding towns, because as Charlotte grows, they grow. And if we look at what's happened the last few years specifically, the amount of growth, whether it is corporate investment and or access to housing, we are going 45 plus minutes outside of Charlotte, even though they may work in Charlotte or are in Charlotte on a regular basis. So we can look at that regional opportunity to have some of those conversations as well. Thank you.
Okay. Any other insight from the committee? Okay.
Anybody else want to leave?
Nope. All right. Looks like you got great insight from everyone here. This is very important work. As you can see, there is passion here. So everyone is ready to get to work and accompany me to Raleigh, right? All right. Well, that's great. Thanks, everyone.